By way of introduction, I'm a historian of public health issues, which means almost anything these days. It's a growing tribe of individuals who have an intense interest in essentially what makes bodies fall apart, particularly on a population level, and also what keeps bodies in motion, what supports can be put in place to make sure the survival and viability of communities. I came through this not in the ordinary way for many public health historians. Many of them were trained in public health schools or in specialized departments, history of science, or history of medicine departments. I came to this as a social historian. I was trained at Princeton University by Nell Painter, who remains one of the foremost social historians of Black and Southern experiences practicing today. That being said, my lens to my material is as a social historian in a lot of ways. I'm very much interested in political economy, for example. Very much interested in spatial organization, particularly when we talk about industrial cities. And I come to this as someone who is very much interested in the experiences of Black Americans in cities, be they as patients or people who experience health conditions in a myriad number of ways. So, for example, how might one say, in any time, say today, how would one experience a particular disease? What roles might one play? And this calls for a show of hands, for a volunteer. Yeah, that's right, as a patient, for example. Yeah. Turn the AC up. How else might one, I mean, from your own, just general thinking, how else might we experience disease? Yes?
As a caregiver?
As a caregiver, right. Professional or family member, right. How else?
Policymaker.
Policymaker, community organizer, activist. Anything else? Didn't you say they get extra credit for raising their hand?
Yes.
I guess no one needs that extra credit. Yeah, there's a myriad ways in which we can experience disease. And a lot of these are socially mediated. That being said, I've spent this early part of my career looking at that. I just finished a book on the history of tuberculosis in the Jim Crow South, which looks at issues of housing and politics and urban development. And as Professor Marable said in his introduction, I'm also embarking on two other projects. One is a look at Caribbean migration to Panama and issues of health, standard of living, labor organization, and ultimately the United States empire. And then the other one, which is more a teaching component, which I'll describe this evening, is about the health history of Harlem. Now, by further way of introduction, I should say a few more comments. I did not come to this project in more or less a traditional way that one might arrive at a project, which is, if there is such a thing as a traditional way, someone might just choose. They might look around and say, well, I've kind of finished one thing, and maybe I should move on to another. It might be more accurate to say that I was actually drafted into this in a way that at the time was very overwhelming. About a year ago, this all happened. But now I'm finding out that this might be a very gratuitous development. I was approached about a year and a half ago by a bunch of older physicians who had practiced here in Harlem, some since the 1950s, which puts them, yes, well into their 80s and early 90s. And many of them were connected with Harlem Hospital, which has a long and storied history here in the Harlem community. And as a group, these individuals were upset, or at least concerned, that there seemed to be no effort to maintain the history, or at least to document and research the history of Harlem Hospital. As a historian, and assuming that this would be a very interesting history, I was incredulous. I assumed that someone was working on it. So I took the phone call and I said, look, I'll look around, I'll see who's working on this, I'll put them in touch with you. I did this for about, in between teaching and other activities, I did this for about a week and found out that there is really a a lamentable dearth of scholarship on this. And I'm not quite sure why, but I'll tell you why there should be more as the talk proceeds. That basically span out into what is now developing into the Harlem Health History Project, which is largely a teaching module which will contain some of my research as well, but also a way in which students can engage the Harlem community, engage history, and engage the history of epidemiology, social history of public health and medicine, and ultimately political economy in what remains the capital of Black America. All right. By the way, if you have questions thus far, please, or at any point, you just stick your hand up. No problem. Anything? No? All right. All right, so that being said, if you're looking at the history of a community and its health issues, a community such as Harlem, there might be several things that you'd be interested in. For example, education, training, practice, and social organization of Black health professionals and non-professionals. Somebody said that one way to experience disease is as a caregiver, professional, or non-professional. Naturally, people tend to organize themselves around this. So if you're a professional caregiver, you might belong to what types of organizations? That's right, physicians' organizations, for example. Yeah. Sooner or later, it's just, what do I have to do? So, yes.
Some kind of elderly network.
Elderly network? Mm-hmm. Elderly caregivers or elderly folks? Or?
Yeah, people who specialize in making, providing caregivers to elderly who don't leave, what's the term?
In-house care,
yeah,
for example, right? So you might be organized through employers. You might be organized through maybe what else? If you're a professional. For a professional organization. Unions, myriad of ways. Professional organizations, the AMA, American Nursing Association, all of those. If you're interested in the history of public health, you have an interest in all of these properly. Because it's not just about physicians in white coats and patients laying, prone upon a bed begging for help. It's actually an entire complexly layered system of networks. If you're a non-professional caregiver, you might belong to a support group, for example, right? People, families of members of Alzheimer's, for example, might be a support group. Families of substance abusers. Narcotics Anonymous is a type of organization. So that's part of this. There's other issues that have been prominent in Harlem's health history. Tuberculosis control. Does anyone know what happened here in Harlem in the early 90s? There was an outbreak, well, speaking of tuberculosis, there was an outbreak of TB here, and there was a lot of moral panic about where it might have originated and where it might spread. And a lot of it was centered here in Harlem. Not much different from what was happening 8 years before that, when Harlem also experienced, slightly less than 80 years ago, around that time, high levels of tuberculosis mortality. There's issues of institutions. There's issues of other disease, HIV/AIDS, for example. Infant and child health, reproductive health, policy and social history, et cetera, et cetera. And lastly, the history of addiction research, therapy, and experience in Harlem. All right. The audience for the HHP is twofold. In the beginning, we're going to start with student research and writing activity. This will be undergraduate. I should say that in an unabashed endeavor of poaching from Professor Marable's class, any of you who are interested in the history of these issues, you certainly would be welcome into the project, assuming that you complete the deadline that he mentioned before his introduction, so we don't get in trouble. After that is developed, there will be community engagements. That's to say that I've been in discussion with health professionals, researchers here in the area, who all are very much interested in this history, not just the aging ones, but people who are actually very active in their earlier mid-careers as well. Now, for my own, what the remaining of my remarks will be, will center around one particular aspect of this, which is what I'm interested in as my own personal research. And that's the history of substance abuse here. When we think of substance abuse, we typically think of the hardcore narcotics, but I'm also interested in alcohol and tobacco as well. For those of you, the quick story, I guess, until you see, what's the new Denzel Washington film? Yeah, so I'll give you the somewhat less dramatic version of heroin in Harlem, which is that heroin had been known in the United States since really the turn of the 20th century. Usership of it was fairly limited to a small group of people who remained pretty much invisible, very much kind of tied to the same networks of people who might use cocaine, for example. Opium was very much part of the daily lives of people who suffered all types of injuries, including surgeries as well. This is before we have real anesthesiology. So there's this underground system of addiction that's been around since certainly the late 19th century. You can even say the mid 19th century as well. Now this escalated in the 50s, largely through the entry of countercultures and I guess you could say a certain amount of juvenile organization. The reason why I'm stumbling there is because I don't want to say necessarily juvenile delinquents, because delinquent obviously is a loaded term, which is from the 1950s largely. But certainly networks of juvenile social organizations were places where heroin entered in the late 50s, after the kind of counterculture jazz scene and beat scene in the 1950s. You see it amongst youth culture in the 60s. By the early to late 60s and the early 1970s, you start to see it in black youth culture in Harlem and other cities. This is a serious problem, largely because public health and the Harlem community specifically were unprepared for it. This is something that really no one saw this coming. A lot of the kind of substance abuse issues that we think of today, I mean, from heroin all the way through meth or any myriad forms, are really kind of post-World War II things. They're kind of part of the social, economic, and cultural geography of the United States after World War II. I mean, when we think of, for example, a lot of methamphetamine consumption, what might we think of? What kind of networks, for example? I mean, not that any one of us is an epidemiologist, but maybe just what you know from the news, for example.
Suburban high schools.
Excuse me?
Suburban high schools.
You have some concentration of in suburbans, right? There's a club scene that uses it, right? I think those are probably the two main places where it's concentrated, even though, by the way, it is starting to make an emergence here in Harlem. I just found that a few days ago. So many of those things are kind of post-World War II phenomena, right? Did we really have suburbs that we think about today? Did we have those in 1930? No, those are really largely a product of highway construction policy, which later became urban renewal, and this place. I mean, there's an entire history that we could go into. But a lot of the disease, a lot of addiction epidemics that we've experienced are really post-World War II. And the early one, heroin, very few people were actually prepared for it, least of all the Harlem community. And it hit very hard. There's also quite a few other factors that went into that. If you think about, let's say, post-1971, 1973 Harlem, being that I think you've read something about this period this week, if I'm correct. What was going on here? Economic downturn, right? In the form of, for example,
The city was broke, so.
Jobs.
I'm sorry, you were. Please finish it.
The city was broke, so natural into Harlem homes already president for the city's shops and stores.
That's right. And then behind you, there was.
I just said loss of employment and jobs.
Oh, correct. Under the declining employment opportunities, and there's something over here.
Abandonment of buildings by landlords.
Right. Okay. Right. Good. Right. Right, so there were confluence of things going on. Now, these are all things that make a community particularly susceptible to substance abuse. It's not the only things. There's a whole spectrum of factors which we can discuss throughout the talk, but those are certainly bellwether indices. And in fact, Harlem became, so to speak, the kind of canary in the mine. All right. Now, how do we think about the history of addiction then? For many, many years, and there's people who still today tend to think of addiction as a kind of moral failing, right? Whatever you personally might think of addiction, certainly as an intellectual exercise, really doesn't help to think of addiction in such terms. I come from a perspective which is more epidemiological and social epidemiological at that, which is to say that we look at disease or illness phenomena on a population level and try to decide what promotes them and what retards them. All right? So part of this might be the idea of, as discussed here or is displayed here, sociopharmacology. Sam Friedman is someone who's putting forth this idea, which he defines as an attempt to, quote, locate drug use in a broader socioeconomic context as it intersects with histories and physiologies of individuals, the social, political, and economic histories and current realities of different populations, communities, and countries, and the pharmacology of drugs. We thus look at our social causation of drug use patterns, where our concept of causation is not one of forces with deterministic impact on individuals, but rather one in which social structures and processes affect the likelihood that individuals will use various drugs. This is what I meant when I said kind of confluence of factors. You can't just say that it's a hard and cold fact that that declines in unemployment will in fact cause, or declines in employment will in fact cause large or increases in substance abuse. It's not. We have examples of places that have had quite severe economic downturns, and substance abuse rates really did not move. But it's a confluence of many factors. Now, it's fortunate that a view such as this has there's a background literature from which I can draw thinking about the Harlem community. The socio-pharmacological perspective looks at essentially social, cultural, and political and economic context, right? We want to know not just who's using what and what becomes stigmatized or what becomes criminalized, rather. We want to know what's going on around it. We want to think of addiction as part of a larger social system. All right? Does that make sense? All right, good. So by framing substance abuse within patterns of substance use, for example, we signal part of this context. To separate abuse from substance use is only really to say that abuse is really on one end of the spectrum. For many people, there's a big difference between someone who goes home after a day of work, particularly successful day or particularly unsuccessful day, and has a couple of drinks. Whereas the official clinical definition of alcoholism is someone who habitually has 2 or more drinks every day. For some of us, that may not make much of a difference. Some people, if you're a complete teetotaler, you might say anyone who has any drink is somewhat dependent upon alcohol. But there's a whole spectrum, and the question is for a social look at addiction, where do we define the spectrum? Why do we criminalize some behaviors while we completely wink an eye at other ones? All right, that's part of an idea of this. Now, in terms of social and or political and economic context, we have I mentioned these authors here because I found what particularly interesting as I'm trying to frame my own ideas about thinking about this, and also how to teach this when I begin this course next year. One is Robert Carlson's idea, who's an anthropologist, and he's called for a way of thinking about the political economy of HIV, AIDS, and substance use. Political economy meaning that what are the structures that promote first heroin use or needle use, then also risky behaviors with HIV/AIDS, but also in a way that we don't think of it as just evil structures and powerless individuals. Because at the end of the day, a project that looks at the history of Harlem must look at its people, right? I mean, you can't just rob an entire community that's effectively a century old agency. So we have to ascribe some sort of some sort of empowered agency to individuals. And a good look at political economy will steer between that silly derivatives of those two poles. Leith Mullings and Alaka Wali have recently done a study of reproductive health and gender relations in the Harlem community. They are both anthropologists as well, and what you might think of as kind of surface, on the surface, this is a study of reproductive health might include 3 to 5 subjects. You would go through the demography of it, statistical, and then you would put it between 2 covers. What they found was actually something really more complex, largely because they're coming at it from not just a demographic and somewhat epidemiological view, but also as ethnographers, people who are very much attuned to the cultural meanings of reproduction. And what they're really bringing to bear is an idea of at what point do we think of a community as being stressed or overstressed, and at what point do we see them as being resilient. You might think that this has nothing to do with the history of addiction, but a theory I would propose is that a lot of what we see in elevated addiction, rates of addiction, is really just ways that people cope with stress. So anything that looks at stress, therefore, has some bearing on substance abuse. And that's another topic I'd like to venture into later on. Any questions thus far? Okay. All right. Then, of course, there's Minnie Thompson-Fullylove's work, who, all non-historians, I think she has done an incredible job of actually presenting a history. And being trained as a historian, there's a certain amount of disciplinary chauvinism. Yes, I'm very much invested in my profession. And she's a community psychiatrist and has brought to bear the idea of root shock. That's to say, what happens to communities when they're displaced? Why might that question be pertinent?
Could you repeat it, please?
Why the question of root shock and its effect upon displaced populations, the psychic effects of that. So, Christensen first.
Displacement is like a current phenomenon, like this passing in Harlem in multiple ways. I mean, it was created by displacement in certain ways. Urban renewal, abandonment, gentrification, all of that. And it's important to put it in that context of psychological effects, because often it's like talked about in material effects of, okay, moving from this apartment to this apartment, but like broader context of community and bonds and all of that.
Did we read Fullyloved for our class last year?
Not really.
Okay. Right, I saw some other hands as well. Yes.
Yeah, just to kind of add to that, being, a member of a displaced population just adds like another stressor to life. So like, in addition to perhaps stresses of being in the city or stresses of being a minority, like, not necessarily knowing like where your roots are, feeling like you're rooted in a certain place is just another stress that's just added on and compounded psychologically.
Absolutely, absolutely.
A good deal of the Harlem population are immigrants to begin with, so there's a vast history of displacement in the Harlem community as well.
That's right. This is an ongoing history. Again, a kind of post-World War II thing. I mean, when we think of the vast displacements of black populations, beginning about, say, what period and maybe what federal policy we'd be thinking of. We talk about a wholesale evacuation or displacement of black communities. Well, right, I mean, yeah, federal urban renewal and destruction of neighborhoods. We're talking about promotion of suburbs, redlining, all of that. We're talking about late 1930s onwards. These are things that Professor Fullylove has brought to bear in terms of a psychiatric perspective. Very much interested in what is a community psyche, what are its viable, its possible responses, and what are the wages of this. And then Kathy Cohen, these are all individuals that I highly recommend, which is why I put them up here. But also people, like I said, who inform, people whose work I teach, even though none of them are historians. Kathy Cohen has written an incredible book about the history of HIV in the early years, black HIV in the early years of the plague. This book, as far as I know, remains probably one of the best histories of the 1981 to about 94, 95 period in terms of capturing black politics and HIV/AIDS. She's a political scientist. All right, so all of these are perspectives that certainly have some bearing on Harlem, USA. Why Harlem? I mean, I think that's kind of self-evident, particularly since I'm in a class that focuses on Harlem. But naturally, it's the capital of Black America. New York City was also a leader in public health, practice, research, and policy. Then, of course, there's the university and the question of its position historically within Harlem and what will its future be, what does it, what are its debts and obligations to the community. And these are all contemporary problems that need historicizing. For the remainder of my time, I want to talk about what are the approaches that one might think about for doing such a project in the history of addiction. First of all, can we talk about a historical epidemiology of addiction? We might describe historical epidemiology as the application of myriad epidemiological methods to past disease phenomena which have occurred on a population level. Any list of models of causality and influence might be used there. Then the next question might be, can we actually apply that to addiction? When we think of epidemiology on a population level, that certainly poses some challenges to how we think about addiction. For example, the ideas of contagious behaviors, which is something that I find particularly interesting. We know today, and we've known for a number of years, for a few decades actually, that certain behaviors are in fact contagious, not in the kind of germological sense that we think of, in the sense that you can't become a substance abuser unless you've been initiated into it. Someone tells you how to purchase heroin, how to cook it, how to acquire paraphernalia. That these things travel by networks, and that's one reason why sociologists have been particularly interested in this. There's a problem with that, though, because when you start thinking about contagious behaviors, you might easily slip into the kind of reactionary rhetoric of urban ghetto pathology, quote unquote, right? Much the same thing that Harlem has been stigmatized unfairly for a good 3 or 4 decades now. You have to steer, there's a kind of Occam's razor there, or a razor's edge that you need to walk in thinking about this. Somewhere in there is interaction between the individual and the social. Like I said before, think of it all as society, and the kind of quote blame society explanation, which with which I certainly had some sympathy. It robs individuals of agency. At the end of the day, we're interested in people actually being whole, well, and healed, right? To say that they have no agency, then you might as well just throw away all hope of that. So there are some individual factors. There's personal history and exposure. Like I said, some behaviors are contagious, and frequent exposure and intense exposure to them very well might make one as an individual susceptible, or a community susceptible to these. There's socialization and personality formation. What coping skills are we given by family and society or culture around us to do other things with stress other than take up substances? For years, psychologists, kind of an aside, have noted that there's less rates of depression in black communities, which is, I think many people have been skeptical about that for a number of years, and kind of one of those ironies where sometimes researchers are the last people to figure out what's kind of almost patently obvious. We find in many black communities people self-medicating. If we think about addiction not as a moral failing, but as a coping mechanism in the face of other stressors, or where either other ways of coping with stress are either unavailable or unknown, then we kind of think of addiction, we can see addiction in a different sense, or substance abuse in a different way, right? That 2 drinks after work it might be the way you cope with that. Sometimes, fried food is, that's a way of coping with stress. Societal factors that, with individual, there's also genetic factors. This is something I don't know quite as much about. I have to do some more research on it. But it's my understanding, at least geneticists believe that there are some genetic predispositions. Now, societal factors, of course, go to much broader ideas or broader processes. How much do we attach a stigma or acceptability to certain practices? It's okay to go to the bar with your buddies after work and have a couple of drinks. However, certainly less so to perhaps procure methamphetamine. All right? There's much stigma attached to one, but not necessarily as much to the other. What are the chances or life chances that promote or discourage substance abuse? What are the nature of social networks? All these are historical questions. All these things happen in processes. They're not just static throughout time. There's possibility of professional and social mobility is an issue. Places we found, what the research indicates, is that places where there's an appreciable degree of social mobility, economic diversity, and vitality are fortified against the type of substance abuse patterns that we might see in other communities. There's also the issue of comorbidity, which is to say that some addictions, like some diseases, occur in patterns with other ones. Rising rates of tuberculosis, for example, you often find in communities where you have a high seroprevalence of HIV. The two are very much comorbid. With crack cocaine in the early 80s, we found out that a lot of people were chasing crack with heroin. That the rapid rush of a cocaine high, crack cocaine high, needed to be tempered with a speedball of heroin. So you often find a lot of comorbidity. Alcoholism, a lot of people who abuse alcohol also use tobacco. Now how do we think about these structures? And this is rounding the bend here. And I just, for an example, this isn't the only way to think about it, but this is another issue, and it's here in New York. I've been thinking about it and I've been teaching. This is the scholars Roderick and Deborah Wallace have looked at what caused rising rates of HIV, cirrhosis, and heroin use and mortality or morbidity in the 1980s and 90s. This were, keep in mind, particularly with HIV and also with heroin. In the 1980s, I mean, the typical explanation for either one of these conditions might have been what, respectively? When we talked about HIV in 1984, if you turned on the TV, what do you think you might have seen? What were the kind of depictions? Excuse me?
You said
84. Right. Particularly the white gay epidemic, which was centered in the West Coast. And then later on, when it started to split to black communities in 86 and 87.
It was even called GRID.
That's right, gay-related infectious disease. And then there was a stigma that went, when it was discovered that there was a smaller epidemic in Haiti, then they were put on a list of it was really a moral panic that was put that of high-risk individuals. And then when the epidemic spread to black communities in 86 and 87, some people would say it was well before that, but certainly that date we know is pretty much being when it started to take a hold. We also added to that was who, in terms of the stigmatized profile. That's right, or intravenous drug addicts specifically, right? What Deborah Roderick Wallace showed is that there are other things besides these other kind of individually focused factors which contribute to diseases such as HIV or use of heroin or cirrhosis and tuberculosis that's looked at as well. And what's interesting is that in this book, which came out in 1998, it's called The Plague on Your Houses. I highly recommend it. I've been teaching it for a few years now, and it's an incredible book. They are epidemiologists who were there on the scene in the 1970s, in the late 1960s, when the city of New York embarked upon a plan of what was called planned shrinkage. And the idea was that they were shrinking fire services in particular parts of New York, even while they were building up other ones. So the hardest hit were East Harlem and South Bronx. And one might think, not having read this book, that rates of fires might not have much to do with heroin use or HIV or tuberculosis or cirrhosis, but in fact they've shown quite graphically, as you see here, that there's a correlation. This basically shows temporally how fires went up and down in New York City. This is for all New York. These graphs here follow exactly the same pattern that you see with epidemics. Epidemics start here with very low frequency, they peak here, and then as people either die off or they survive and become immunized against it, it drops down. That's an interesting thing, because we're looking at fires here. Part of the argument is that fires actually follow an epidemic pattern. They don't just randomly happen, which is what policymakers might have said in the 1970s and 1980s. Interesting enough, what you find is a housing crunch. People have become more crowded in houses, the ones that are left standing. Hence, you have rising rates of some of the diseases I mentioned. You might think of tuberculosis, for example. At the same time, when houses are left to burn, this is cirrhosis here. A housing crunch obviously causes a certain amount of stress on the people who experience it. Cirrhosis, of course, is a liver disease brought about most frequently by alcoholism. You see high rates of mortality, particularly a spike in an epidemic curve. You're looking at a very stressed community. High rates of cirrhosis mortality. And then intravenous drug use overdose. You see these areas. By the way, these I didn't explain, but in the South Bronx, these were the areas that really got burned out right here by benign neglect. And across the river here would be East Harlem, which is not in this map, but you saw a similar process. A lot of IV drug use, and of course, at this period, that would have been a gateway or an entry for HIV/AIDS. For historical epidemiology, we would look at methods such as GIS, unpublished and published sources, demographic analyses, etc., to kind of think about, are there processes such as this that go on for epidemics before and after the great burnout of 1969-1980. There's also the intellectual and professional history of addiction, which is, as we kind of alluded at the beginning of the talk, we need to think about how are people organized to think about epidemics or to think about diseases, addiction, or tuberculosis, or anything in a black community. This is an idea that first struck me when I was approached by retired black physicians who remained organized amongst themselves, even though most of them were not practicing. And if they were practicing, it was on very minimal. They weren't actively seeing patients. They might have served on a state board of some sort. There's a policy history of addiction. If any of you know anything, and I think we all do, anything about the history of substance abuse policy, we know it's a very flawed history, leaving us with a large chunk of the problem of this industrial complex derives from just really, I think the technical term I'm looking for is piss poor drug policy. You have to look at my Oxford dictionary, but I think that's the term I'm looking for. But these are things that a history of addiction on a community level certainly must look at. And then finally, there's the social and cultural history of addiction. As I said earlier in the talk, you cannot perform this type of work without thinking about what are community responses to these health problems, be it addiction or any other many health problems that we have. So, in one respect, we should think about what are community responses from in the post-World War II era. From 1950s, treatment was barely available. I interviewed a woman who practiced medicine here in Harlem and kind of just fell into being someone who treated heroin addicts. No training in it whatsoever, but there was nothing available. And being a community physician, people would come to her and say, I have this Jones, I have this monkey in my back. How can you help me? And she just quickly did some research and soon had a burgeoning clientele. This she maintained until the early 1970s when Harlem Hospital opened the first heroin treatment program in Harlem. And only did so because a number of community activists actually physically sat in the hospital for a week and said they would not leave until the hospital opened this up. These are instances of where social movements actually force policy and force professional organization, even when institutions and professionals seem loath to actually respond. This group here is a group called the East Harlem Protestant Parish, which in the late 1950s to the late 1960s organized a kind of treatment regime for heroin addicts with varying degrees of success, but using a religious but also a somewhat socio-medical perspective. It was a liberal theological organization. These, and then of course you have what the Black Panthers and the Young Lords were doing here, where they opened their own heroin treatment clinics, as well as mobile tuberculosis and just general health clinics. These are things that we know about from our studies there. I think that's a good place to leave off. I hope I've given you an adequate sketch of what will be keeping you busy for the next few years or so. And again, anyone who's interested in knowing more about this or writing any type of research, I'd be very much interested to talk to you about it. Thank you.
We're short on time, so maybe if we have maybe 2 or 3 quick questions.
I'm actually particularly curious about the policy history of addiction that you discussed. And in terms of law enforcement, probably a more recent phenomena as opposed to just throwing people who are found with any sort of narcotics in prison or in jail, depending on the amount. There have been development of treatment courts and portions of parts of the courts that are actually designed to address the needs of people who are suffering from these types of addictions. Obviously, like I said, this is something that's obviously fairly new, but I'm curious to know from you how effective have these newer drug courts or drug treatment courts been? Where are they now, and I guess what more do they need to do to really adequately address the issues that you've raised?
Correct. Yeah. That's an excellent question, which to not waste it all, say I really do not know at all. I'm aware of what drug courts, what their function is, in terms of what their efficacy is as a kind of, I mean, first of all, as a adjurance, prudence policy institution. I'm not sure what their effectiveness is thus far, or on a public health level, what it's been. My instinct, what I've just heard about from people who have engaged them, or what I've, it's kind of my layman's experience, is that it's certainly a better alternative where treatment is available than the more punitive measures, the old, just lock away kind of individual approach. Now, whether or not as an institution or as a policy has enough support, enough resources, or enough guidance, I can't say. That's one of the things which would be part of the project, research at that level. By the way, also, a large component of the project is also oral histories. So we would probably be talking with judges, prosecutors, maybe even defendants.
Is there any element of the project that looks at who's using the community as far as class or income level, or I know like art, there's this huge history of artists being big drug users, and so I'm just interested if that's even a component that you're looking at.
Yeah, well, heroin started in the 50s with jazz, and there was a certain type of middle-class bohemian sociability to it. Back then, heroin was cheaper. It was more pure, and so you didn't have a lot of the kind of communal dislocations that typically attend an epidemic of heroin use after, say, 1960 or 65. It was kind of a fad. I'm not saying that people were not addicted eventually. I mean, it's a very dangerous drug if you don't want it. It's not entirely addictive. If people manage it, then it might not wreck your life. But it did not take the toll, largely because the numbers of people using it and the nature of the substance itself that it would later on. Now here's the thing, in about 61, there was a shortage of heroin, largely because of rising demand, and then also something happened with supply. I think either supply was cut off in France. I think we were switching, a lot of it came from France during that time. I think there might have been problems there. But what dealers soon learned, and this is what I gleaned just from reading the literature of what sociologists were writing at the time in some of the newspapers, what they learned is that you could adulterate heroin and still sell to people who, it had a very elastic demand in the sense that there's some people out there who will take heroin no matter what, no matter what quality or how far they have to go to get it. And from thereafter, from my understanding, is where we started having chopped up product, where we start to see that kind of line where it goes from the people who import it to the person who's, who a major distributor, kind of wholesaler, all the way down to bagman to the person on the corner. And on each level, it gets cut up. And that's where another problem we have is because that when it's that adulterated, at that point you're looking like 5% purity on a good day. The high is very short-lived, and the person who's addicted is more or less constrained to a life of making sure they have the next cop, so to speak, the next high. So, and from that point, it's no longer about kind of that middle-class bohemian sociability. Then we have a hardcore, class-inflected. Not to say that, obviously, quite a few middle-class people also became addicts, but then also really hit people who were also economically on hard straits as well. After this is like post-1960s, 65 or so. Okay.
Any questions? All right, last question.
All right, I think your hand was up for a while.
I'm really interested in the fires that fall on the epidemic. That's really interesting to me. I couldn't really know from your PowerPoint what year those graphs were, and is it still happening? Can you basically follow the depletion of fire stations around the city?
Well, yeah, this was, every few years, a New York mayor will announce the closing of a firehouse someplace. And usually there's a lot of communal reaction to it, particularly post 1969 to 1980. Because after a while, people got it. The reason why there's so much problem going on is because there's just no fire support. The policy was first initiated in 69 or so. And people developed it weren't even government, they weren't city hall people, it was the Rand Corporation, which was also responsible for a lot of our Vietnam policy at the time as well. They were the ones who actually formulated this policy of planned shrinkage, even though many people protested at the time that certain things would happen. No one predicted HIV/AIDS, but people did predict that housing shortages would cause root shock and some other conditions, which proved to be right. Today, I'm not quite so sure on a system level, how many epidemic fires we have these days, what the scope of fire support looks like. So I can't say what's going on today. But the main focus of that book is really 1969 to say the early 90s or so, the period of burning, and then post-1980 when we start to reap the harvest of that. And it's Wallace and Wallace, 800 houses. Okay. Thank you very much.
All right.